I'm Greg Johnson, director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at UCSB, and also professor of religious studies. It's really great to see you all here. We braved the rain, even though we had a promise of sun, so thanks for doing that. And I also appreciate it's the end of the quarter, that we're all worn down a bit, particularly you students. So again, thanks for being here. While I'm talking, please take a look at our spring events. Some of them are ones we're the primary sponsors of at the Capps Center. Others we're delighted to be co-sponsors of. Anyhow, a great roster of upcoming events. A few thank yous. First to Professor Joe Blankholm for organizing the visit of Professor Gorski, and to Dr. Dusty Hosley and Leilani Calkins at the Capps Center who've organized this for us. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Departments of Religious Studies and Sociology, and the Humanities and Social Change Center. A land acknowledgement, we are of course on Chumash lands here at UCSB. Chumash peoples are alive and well and among us. We need to do better as an institution to honor their presence and perpetuate their futures. Now to our guest, Philip Gorski. In addition to having graduated from Deep Springs, is Frederick and Laura Goff Professor of Sociology and Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, where, among other duties, he convenes the Religion and Politics Colloquium at the Macmillan Center. Doctor received his PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley in 1996. Before arriving at Yale in 2004, he spent the first part of his career at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Along the way, he has had visiting positions at a number of prestigious institutions. Dr. Gorski is a comparative historical sociologist with strong interests in theory and methods and in modern and early modern Europe. His empirical work focuses on topics such as state formation, nationalism, revolution, economic development, and secularization, with particular attention to the interaction of religion and politics. Dr. Gorski is a prolific author of books and articles spanning a range of topics, some of which touch rather close to our current cultural predicament, including his recent co-authored book with Samuel Perry in 2022, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. You might know, Phil, that Sam was here just as the book was coming out, and that was great to have him here at that moment. We were all hoping that moment was receding. Alas, looks like it's not. Nothing against Sam. He gave us more the quantitative side, as you might imagine. Many wonderful graphs and lots of details and facts. I think rounding out the picture from your perspective is much needed. Prior to that book, in 2017, he published American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present. Earlier in his career, he co-edited Max Weber's Economy and Society, A Critical Companion. And his first book came out in 2003, The Disciplinary Revolution, Calvinism, and the Rise of the State in Early Modern Europe. His talk today is Disenchantment of the World, or Fragmentation of the Sacred. Please join me in welcoming Philip Gorski.
Okay, let me cut straight to the chase. Max Weber's theory of disenchantment is wrong. It's wrong as a diagnosis of the modern condition, and it is wrong as a historical explanation of how that condition came about. The truth is that we have never been disenchanted. In my talk today, I'm going to sketch an alternative account, the fragmentation of the sacred. Not disenchantment so much as fragmentation, or more concretely, the gradual collapse of the Catholic monopoly over the sacred, beginning in the Middle Ages. That, in a nutshell, is my diagnosis of the modern situation and my story of how we got there. My talk is in 3 parts. I'll begin with a brief review and critique of Weber's theory of disenchantment. I'll then elaborate my own theory of fragmentation, and I'll close by reflecting briefly on the implications of the theory. So on to part 1. Disenchantment is the English language translation of a German neologism, Entzauberung. A more literal, if less poetic, translation would be demagification. In what follows, I'll stick to the more literal version. Demagification plays two roles in Weber's theory. On the one hand, it serves as part of his diagnosis of modernity. Here, the contrast is to the animated cosmos of the ancient Greeks, a world that was full of life and of meaning and gods and fates, in contrast to the material and mechanical universe of Western modernity, which is dead and devoid of meaning, or rather of any objective meaning grounded in an external source. Whatever meaning there is, says Weber, is subjective. It comes from within. Demagification is also an explanation of modernity. And here the contrast is between magic and religion, or more specifically, between magical and religious forms of social action. Magical action in Weber's theory has two defining characteristics. First, it is oriented towards this worldly ends, life and love, wealth and progeny, and so on. Second, magical action enlists non-human powers, gods, spirits, forces, and so on. Now, Weber never defined religion explicitly, but he did define it implicitly, in opposition to magic. Religion is a form of social action oriented towards otherworldly ends, salvation, nirvana, and so on. A form of action that involves ethics rather than ritual, inner dispositions rather than external powers. Demagification is closely connected to two other master concepts in Weber's work, differentiation and rationalization. The emergence of religion in Weber's sense goes together with the differentiation of the cosmos into two ontologically distinct domains, the mundane and the supramundane, or in colloquial Christian terms, heaven and earth. This fracturing of the world, argues Weber, creates tensions within the world that then catalyze further processes of differentiation, ultimately giving rise to no less than 7 distinct value spheres or life orders, namely religious, familial, political, economic, scientific, aesthetic, and erotic. Each sphere or order is in turn composed of 3 components: an ultimate value, such as salvation or power or beauty, a class of experts or virtuosos who interpret and embody this value, and followers or lay people under their supervision and control. The differentiation of the value spheres creates the context for processes of rationalization. Rationalization, as Weber understands it, can take 2 basic forms. Substantive rationalization, which involves the gradual articulation of an ultimate value and its differentiation from other competing values or ends, salvation versus wealth or power versus beauty. Formal rationalization, which involves the technical refinement of the means to these ends, whatever they may be. Weber weaves these 3 concepts together into a historical narrative that explains the rise of Western modernity. It begins with the Hebrew prophets. They first developed a religion of ethical monotheism. It then continues with Pauline Christianity, which universalizes ethical monotheism by extending it from the Jews to the Gentiles. Roman Catholicism in this narrative temporarily reverses the trend towards rationalization. It reverts to a magical form of Christianity. The final breakthrough comes with the Protestant Reformation, specifically its Calvinist form, with its radically transcendent God and its deeply ascetic morality. Then the personal God of Western Christianity is gradually displaced by the impersonal orders of modern society, the value spheres. Now, Weber himself rarely used the word secularization, but Karl Jaspers, Peter Berger, Charles Taylor, and others did. They then elaborated a theory of secularization around Weber's three master concepts of disenchantment, differentiation, and rationalization. So, what's wrong with the theory? Well, for starts, magic, even in the narrowest sense, has certainly not disappeared. It pervades secular culture in various forms, from spirituality to astrology to wellness. It also pervades religious cultures as well. Think here of Pentecostalism and the prosperity gospel. The most that one can perhaps honestly say is that the forces invoked in modern day forms of magic are often impersonal rather than personal ones. Energy and life force and inner power and so on. And it should be added that the penumbra of magic extends deep into secular popular culture, even into popular science. Think of wellness or cosplay or divas or ufology, just to name a few examples. Weber's claims regarding the disenchanted character of Puritanism are also badly mistaken. Contemporary historians of Puritanism have amply demonstrated the ongoing importance of magical thinking and practices, even within the Calvinist milieu. And to the degree that the Puritans and other religious reformers did succeed in expelling some forms of magic from the churches, they simply ceded control of it to non-clerical movements and subcultures. Surely it is no accident that modern forms of esotericism arose precisely in the Calvinist regions of Europe. Meanwhile, Catholic reformers quickly gave up their own efforts in this direction, seeking to domesticate popular magic instead. Even the Freemasons, these supposed avatars of Enlightenment rationality, engaged in their own forms of quasi-magic ritual. Like the Neo-Weberian theory of secularization, my theory of fragmentation is constructed around three major conceptual distinctions: sacred versus profane, transcendence versus immanence, and monopolization versus fragmentation. Taken together, they provide the foundations for a different narrative of Western modernity and an alternative diagnosis of the modern condition. I use the sacred-profane distinction in a more or less typical Durkheimian sense. It has both an ontological and a moral dimension. That is, it includes things as well as actions. Sacred things are special and set apart. Profane things are ordinary and everyday. Or, better, in the language of Anne Taves, ordinary versus non-ordinary. Sacred actions are encouraged or enjoined, profane actions forbidden or indifferent. My approach diverges sharply from Durkheim's in one key respect, however. I assume that there are always multiple and competing forms of the sacred in any given context, and that the sacred is a site of contestation. Glossing Bourdieu's concept of classification struggles, we might speak indeed of sacralization struggles. The immanent, I didn't finish that slide. The immanent transcendent distinction refers to two types of social imaginaries. It has an ontological as well as a historical dimension. Immanent imaginaries envision a unified cosmos. The population of the immanent cosmos includes various invisible and non-human powers and persons, which the late Marshall Solins referred to as metapersons. Transcendent imaginaries, by contrast, are ontologically dualistic. They envision a dualistic cosmos composed of a higher and a lower realm. Two realms that are ontologically discontinuous, meaning that it is not easy to pass from one realm to the other. Great effort or great power is required. This in contrast to immanent imaginaries in which persons and metapersons regularly intermingle and even interbreed, as the Greek gods sometimes did with humans. The immanent transcendent distinction also marks a historical transition, the transition that Karl Jaspers famously referred to as the axial age, the period stretching roughly from the awakening of the Buddha to the appearance of Muhammad, the period when the so-called world religions first emerged, the period when religious communities split off from political communities, and when religious intellectuals liberated themselves from political authority. Jaspers and other neo-Weberians speak of a transcendental breakthrough during the Axial Age. This is where my account starts to diverge from theirs. Following the historical anthropologist Alan Stratern, I argue that this breakthrough was only ever partial and that it can never be fully complete. Transcendent religions cannot dispense with immanence, and for at least 5 reasons. First, because they must root themselves in the material world. Second, because they need the protection of earthly powers. Third, because they must address the earthly wants of their lay followers. Fourth, because they present the transcendent realm through the lens of earthly one. And 5, because they inevitably include intercessory figures qua metapersons. As a result, the world religions are shot through with a constitutive tension between transcendence and immanence, and this tension is the root of many of the debates and conflicts that arise within them. Seen from this vantage point, all transcendent social imaginaries are actually mixed types that include an immanent dimension. The third and final distinction is between fragmented and monopolistic systems of authority over the sacred. In their purest form, monopolistic systems have the following 5 characteristics. They are centralized, they are hierarchical, they are hierocratic, they are universalistic, and they are exclusive. For our purposes, the medieval papacy is the key example, even the paradigmatic example. It is centralized in Rome, it has a clear chain of command, it is controlled by a priestly caste, it seeks to evangelize all of humanity, and it rejects rival creeds as falsehoods. By contrast, fragmented systems tend to be localized, polyarchic, meritocratic, particularistic, and inclusive. Here, ancient Greece is an excellent example. There were multiple cultic centers, multiple priestly authorities. Religious authority was based on results as much as revelation. Ambitions were not universalistic, nor was exclusive allegiance demanded of their followers. This distinction is, of course, an ideal typical one, and all of the usual Weberian caveats apply. Now, the endpoint of most versions of secularization theory is the decline or disappearance of religion, however conceived. This includes most versions of neo-Weberian secularization theory as well. The turning point in both forms of the secularization narrative is typically the early modern period. That is, the 3 centuries from the onset of the Protestant Reformation and the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. Round numbers 1500 to 1800. Some accounts emphasize the scientific revolution, others the democratic revolutions, others some combination of these events. The neo-Weberian narratives are usually sung the non-Weberian narratives are usually sung in a major key as a libretto of liberation, where the neo-Weberian narratives are more often recited in a minor key as tragic tales of loss. Otherwise, they are largely in agreement. Both versions of secularization theory are inadequate and for much the same reasons. Both mistake the decline of Christian belief and practice and the separation of church and state for the rise of disenchantment and the triumph of differentiation. In doing so, they overlooked the persistence of immanent forms of the sacred and their penetration into the secular. Consequently, they misunderstand the existential situation and political challenges of the present. I'll have a bit more to say about this in the conclusion, but now on to fragmentation theory. Its endpoint is quite different. The gradual collapse of the Roman monopoly over the sacred, or what is the same thing, the beginning of the fragmentation of the sacred. The keynote is neither liberation nor loss, but something more like return. Return to something like the status quo ante, a kind of neo-immanence, if you will. From the perspective of fragmentation theory, then, the cultural and political situation of the modern West has more in common with that of late imperial Rome than with any period in between, though there are also some important differences that I will also note in due course. Now, like the disenchantment narrative, the fragmentation narrative is a story in three rough chapters: a period of pre-Christian fragmentation, a period of Roman consolidation and monopoly, slowly giving way again over several phases to a situation of post-Christian fragmentation. The story is most easily recounted with the help of three metaphors: the temple, the garden, and the priesthood. The temple houses the sacred, the garden contains magical power, the priesthood controls both. Now, in pre-Christian Rome, there was not one temple, but many. Public temples to various gods, private temples to personal ancestors. Some gods were associated with particular places and people. Athena to Athens and the Athenians, for instance, but these relations were never exclusive. Where the gods were concerned, polygamy and polyamory were the rule, not monogamy. Nor were the gods much admired for their morality. Rather, they were worshipped for their power, for their ability to make things happen in the world. During this period, the garden was still inside the temple because sacred power simply was earthly power. The power to influence earthly events, such as the birth of a child or victory in battle. The power to secure earthly goods, such as a good harvest or a long life. Sacred power was immanent power. Nor was there a single priestly caste during this era. There were priestly elites, of course, who underwent various processes of initiation, presided over specific cults, controlled access to specific powers. But prestigious priestly roles were often occupied by political elites, often on a temporary basis, and popular cultic leaders could and did attract mass followings with their promises of earthly blessing. In short, priestly authority was highly fragmented. Second Temple Judaism presaged the coming Roman monopoly. There was to be one temple, a temple to the one true God, to whom all other gods or powers were to be subordinated. Likewise, all other temples to the one true God were to be subordinated to Jerusalem's. There was to be a hereditary priestly caste that governed the rights of the temple. Laymen could not act as priests any longer. Reformist factions within the priestly caste emphasized the importance of ethical law over ritual sacrifice. Of course, this did not prevent members of the non-priestly strata from engaging in magical or heretical or superstitious practices. The Hebrew scriptures and histories abound with their stories, but it was the emergence of a transcendent ethical monotheism which transformed these practices into magic, heresy, and superstition in the first place. In sum, transcendent ethical monotheism was a historical condition of possibility for a priesthood that claimed a monopoly over legitimate forms of the sacred. Now, it's important to emphasize that Second Temple Judaism was not the only version of transcendent ethical monotheism. The most obvious exceptions were Stoicism and Neoplatonism, nor was Second Temple Judaism the first version of transcendent ethical monotheism in the greater Mediterranean region. That honor arguably belongs to the short-lived sun cult of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. However, the religion we know as Christianity arose first as a movement within Judaism. As such, it is that version of transcendent ethical monotheism that is at the root of modern Western culture and religion. That Roman Christianity would eventually achieve a monopoly of this sort in what became the West, or would at least claim such a monopoly, this was the result of a highly contingent series of developments. Amongst others, the rapid spread of the Jesus movement under the protective umbrella of the Pax Romana, the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity and the gradual imposition of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Western Empire and the growing role of the Roman Church and its episcopal hierarchy and the governance of post-imperial Western Europe. The result was a consequential and, in my view, unique situation. A single hierarchical and hierocratic organization, relatively autonomous from worldly powers of princes and warriors, that could effectively claim a monopoly over legitimate forms of the sacred within a particular territory. Nowhere else in world history, so far as I can tell, do we find a parallel situation. Of course, claiming a monopoly and achieving it are two different things. The monopolization process was not the work of a century, but of a millennium. The millennium stretching roughly between Emperor Constantine and Pope Nicholas II. During this period, the sacred was concentrated in and around the temple, more specifically in and around a hierarchically organized and homologously structured network of churches centered in and dependent upon Rome. Consider ritual life. In the pre-Christian empire, even in the early Christian empire, life cycle rituals governing birth, marriage, and death were under the control of the family and were celebrated in private. By the High Middle Ages, the Roman Church claimed a monopoly over the rites of baptism, weddings, and burials, and had imposed a Christian interpretation on them. These rituals were to be celebrated in or near church. Baptism at the baptismal font, marriage on the church steps, funerals in the adjacent cemetery. This was a gradual process not really completed until the scholastic era in both theory and practice. The concentration of ritual life in and around churches went hand in hand with the monopolization of sacred power by a priestly caste. The caste-like character of the Catholic priesthood was a product of the so-called Gregorian reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries. They abolished, or at least stemmed, various abuses and corruptions. Clerical marriage gave way to clerical celibacy. Power over priestly appointments shifted substantially from princes to popes. The ordination ritual was included among the 7 sacraments of the Roman Church. The new priestly caste effectively claimed control over churchly rituals and sacraments. The concentration of the sacred in the church and the monopolization of access to the sacred in the priesthood went together with a third process. Let's call it the domestication of the garden, or what is the same thing, the Christianization of sacred power under the supervision of the clergy. No one at this time denied the existence or importance of immanent forms of sacred power, least of all the clergy. Rather, the effort was to Christianize and control it, and where that was not possible, to simply weed it out. Much was written about the various forms of immanent powers, angels and demons, white and black magic, natural and supernatural magic, and so on. But the goal was domestication and control, not exclusion or suppression. Now, that is not the usual interpretation. The modern historiography of Western Christendom is full of titillating tales about medieval magic, superstition, and heresy. Likewise, of binary distinctions between pagan remnants and true Christianity, or official religion and popular religion, or false and true religion. In truth, none of these distinctions really carry water. Now, it is true that a reformist faction of the Catholic clergy, including the popes, rearticulated a more fully transcendent vision of the Christian cosmos during this period, a vision that emphasized divine omnipotence and a sharp line between God and humanity. And it is also true that this reform drive raised questions about the status of various practices and rituals and their relationship to Christianity. But the answer to that question was usually domestication, not exclusion or suppression. There was, of course, exclusion, including violent exclusion of Jews and Muslims, and also of so-called heretics, and indeed of any group or movement that challenged or rivaled Christianity's claim to universality and exclusivity. But this, too, was just another facet of the process of monopolization. The monopolization process probably reached its apogee sometime around the year 1200. It was then followed by repeated waves of fragmentation that have continued to reverberate right up to the present day. In fact, the first wave of monopolization was already gathering force as the final wave of monopolization was cresting. Some sources of that first wave originated within the Roman Church itself. There were, to begin, new monastic orders that did not fit into the Church's diocesan structure or its episcopal hierarchy. There were also lay movements of various kinds that challenged the monopoly of the priestly caste. Lay confraternities challenged the concentration of sacred spaces and rituals, for example, and female beguines challenged the male monopoly over sacred personhood. Other sources of the first wave of fragmentation originated outside the church. Economic and demographic expansion strengthened a traditional rival of ecclesiastical power, the princes, while creating a new one, the cities. During the investiture controversy, popes had claimed the right to make and unmake emperors. Just 2 centuries later, the tables were turned. During a series of papal schisms, emperors and kings claimed the right to make and unmake popes. Meanwhile, wealthy city-states such as Venice and Antwerp asserted the right to hire and fire clergy, as did wealthy noblemen. In retrospect, the papacy's monopoly over the sacred was as short-lived as it was hard-won. The next wave of fragmentation arrived with the Protestant Reformation. The result was not the shattering of Christendom, as the old historical cliché has it. The old Roman monopoly was simply replaced by a new European oligopoly, composed of 3 competing religious firms, Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist, each of which sought to monopolize the religious market in a particular territory. Reformation historians typically refer to this process as confessionalization. But confessionalization was not always successful, and this proved consequential. In general, it was least successful in the Calvinist region of Europe that stretched along the Rhine from Switzerland through the Low Countries over to Great Britain and on to its American colonies. There were 2 reasons for this failure. One was the relatively decentralized and democratic character of political rule in this heavily urbanized region, which made imposing a single faith on the population more difficult. Another was the strong emphasis on communal discipline and purity within the Reformed churches, which made it difficult to effectively integrate entire communities within local congregations. This historical juncture had 2 unintended consequences: religious dissent and pluralism, and somewhat later, religious sectarianism and toleration. What then of the Magic Garden? Like their medieval predecessors, the Protestant reformers generally advanced a more transcendental version of Christianity. They sought to shrink and weed the garden. These efforts were most pronounced in the Calvinist areas of Europe, though not nearly as pronounced as Weber and his followers have led us to believe. The Calvinists were fierce iconoclasts, to be sure, even anti-ritualists. But to claim that they disenchanted the world, or in our terms, that they dispensed with immanence, is simply not true. What is true is that the Calvinists embraced a more immaterial form of immanence, one that emphasized spiritual powers, divine providence, and the power of words. Which is not to say that material forms of immanence disappeared during this period. In fact, one could argue the very opposite. For it was precisely in the Calvinist areas that new forms of non-Christian immanence first took hold: esotericism, occultism, spiritualism, transcendentalism, and so on. The Reformed churches did not suppress magic and superstition, as some historians have argued. They simply ceded control over it to leaders and groups outside of the fold. The next major wave of fragmentation arrived in the late 18th century, in the era of revolution and revival. The central trend of this period was individualization, or more specifically, the sacralization of the individual and the individualization of the sacred. The individual came to be understood as the bearer of sacred rights. Key among these rights was the freedom of conscience. Which religion, if any, to follow was now to be a matter of individual choice, and as such protected by the state. If the democratic revolutions of this era helped to institutionalize individual rights, the religious revivals of the period helped to relocate the sacred deep inside the self. Beginning in the late 17th century, the Protestant world was visited by a series of revivalist movements and awakenings that continue on into the present day. Movements that sought to revive or awaken the spirit of Christianity from its lethargy or sleep. These revival movements originated in small groups of pious lay people. Pietism began this way, so did Methodism. The movement changed shape over the next half-century. Small gatherings gave way to mass revivals, large multi-day affairs, often held outdoors, usually advertised in advance, and typically headlined by itinerant charismatic preachers, men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Revivalist Christianity was a matter of individual emotion and experience, or, as we now say, a religion of the heart. The next wave of fragmentation crashed ashore during the 19th century. The central trend during this era was hybridization, the combination of Christian and non-Christian fragments of the sacred. The driving forces behind this process were the Industrial Revolution and colonial expansion. Of course, European colonialism was nothing new by this time, but the invention of the steamship and the railroad accelerated colonial expansion and deepened intercultural interaction. People, things, and ideas could now circulate faster and further, and this included religious ones. The result, however, was not simply the imposition of Western religion on non-Western peoples, rather a complex intermixing of European and non-European beliefs, rituals, and artifacts. Consider the example of Hatha Yoga, the most popular form of yoga practice in the contemporary West. It is often presented as a secularized or watered-down version of an ancient Indian religious practice. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, it was a hybrid of Greek dance, Western calisthenics, and postural yoga that originally crystallized in the West and was then re-exported to India with the help of Indian gurus. Nor should hybridization be understood solely as an intermixing of Western and non-Western religions. Consider the example of mindfulness meditation, a complex amalgam of Buddhist and Hindu beliefs and practices, which also comes in medical and therapeutic variants that have been validated with the tools of Western science. More, it has been adopted not only by many Christian and Jewish people and groups, but also by corporate HR and PR departments as a means of showing concern for the spiritual welfare of employees, while, of course, also increasing worker productivity. The Western world is now being buffeted by yet another wave of fragmentation. The central trend in the present era is towards the fragmentation of experience itself, including experiences of the sacred. The key drivers of this latest wave would appear to be two: the invention of the internet and the expansion of the attention economy. Here, German social theorists' theory of resonance helps us to see what is going on. To recall, Rosa distinguishes three different axes or types of resonance: horizontal, diagonal, and vertical. The horizontal dimension involves resonance with other people, individually or collectively. The diagonal dimension refers to resonance with objects, whether natural or man-made. And the horizontal dimension the vertical dimension denotes resonance with a sense totality, be it natural or supernatural. One might perhaps add a fourth or circular dimension of resonance as well, a feeling of resonance with one's own true or best or highest self. The important point here is that religious rituals such as the Christian liturgy created a context in which all three or four dimensions of resonance can potentially come together and coincide, and in which they become attached to particular times, places, people, and things, and to exemplars of the good life and principles of justice. Rituals focus collective attention. By contrast, social media and the attention economy splinter and disrupt experiences of the sacred. Let me briefly sum up this historical narrative once again in terms of my three metaphors of temple, garden, and priesthood. We begin in an age of immanent pluralism. There are many temples, many priests, no boundary between the temple and the garden. This is roughly the situation in pre-Christian Greece and Rome. Indeed, it's the default situation in this historical era. Then comes a period of incipient transcendence, which takes the form of ethical monotheism. A central temple claims a sacred monopoly in Egypt or later in Israel. The temple is presided over by a priestly caste which seeks to fence in and control the magic garden. Next comes a period of transcendent breakthroughs during the so-called Axial Age, which takes different forms in different places. For a series of highly contingent reasons, Christianity becomes the dominant form of ethical monotheism in the Roman Empire. Over the course of a millennium, Roman Catholicism gradually achieves an effective monopoly over the legitimate forms of the sacred within what remains of the Western Empire. There's a central temple with an ample magic garden controlled by a unified priestly caste. This, to emphasize, is an exceptional situation. Nowhere else in the world does the sacred come under the control of a single hierarchical organization that advances a universalistic and exclusionary understanding of the sacred. But this sacred monopoly begins to fall apart almost as soon as it is achieved. By the 13th century, rival centers of economic and political power are challenging the monopoly. At the same time, new movements arise within the organizational cracks in the church itself. It begins to splinter from within. Next comes the Protestant Reformation. Monopoly gives way to oligopoly. Multiple and competing centers of sacred power emerge. There are 3 temples instead of 1 in Geneva, Wittenberg, and Rome. The Roman temple retains, even expands its magic garden. The Calvinist priests in charge of the Genevan temple imagine an invisible garden composed of pure spirits. As a result, other would-be priests gradually colonize and replant the old garden with various forms of material magic. The age of revolution and revival opens the market age in Western religion. There are now many temples, many gardens, great and small, and many would-be priests in search of customers. Most claim to be Christian, but not all. The age of colonial expansion and the Industrial Revolution leads to a global market in the sacred. Gurus and entrepreneurs import and export, assemble and disassemble and reassemble, mix and match fragments of the sacred from around the world, creating new products and marketing them to new clienteles. Some of these fragments are still labeled religious, others secular, still others spiritual. For many, what remains of the temple is now located within the recesses of their own hearts, and the boundary between the temple and the garden has all but disappeared. Let me now conclude. The fragmentation narrative leaves us with a very different sense of the present and its relationship to the past than the disenchantment narrative. The disenchantment narrative suggests that Western modernity is exceptional in its secularity. It is a narrative of the world we have lost, a story infused with a sense of nostalgia or even of tragedy. It implies that the greatest challenge we face today is a loss of meaning or even of outright meaninglessness. It paints a world of relentless rationality and soulless systems, a world that is nonetheless exceptional in some way, or at least ahead of everyone else. Orthodox secularization narratives simply give this story a more positive twist. Magic gives way to science, superstition to reason, oppressive moralities are replaced with individual rights, religious humbug is swept out of the public square, and another obstacle to progress is cleared out of the way. I don't know about you, but this is not the world I see out there right now. The fragmentation narrative paints a very different picture. It suggests that Western modernity is normal in its pluralism. It is a narrative of return, a return to a status quo ante. Because in many ways, modern Western culture more nearly resembles early Christian Roman culture than anything in between. There are multiple and competing visions of the world, offering various mixtures of transcendence and immanence, but with immanence being the main ingredient in most. But transcendence may be on the wane rather than on the rise. That is perhaps the key difference, and time will tell. Be that as it may, it is a world that is neither exceptional nor ahead, just normal, at least by world historical standards. Of course, to say that this world is normal is not to say that it is happy. just that its challenges do not stem from disenchantment. Existentially, the problem is not so much a loss of meaning as an abundance of meanings. No, meanings are readily available to anyone who seeks them. What is elusive is a collective sense of meaning with a capital M, or even a sense of the meaning capital M of one's own life, or whether that something is worth seeking at all. Why not just be happy with a mosaic of meanings assembled out of so many fragments of the sacred? These existential dilemmas generate political dilemmas as well. Politically, the problem of our time is not so much an excess of rationality as of irrationality. Weber speculated, perhaps even hoped, that a charismatic leader might free us from the iron cage of rationality. That hope may seem misplaced to us, but not to everyone. On the contrary, authoritarian movements led by charismatic demagogues seem everywhere on the rise. And perhaps we should not be so surprised by this. After all, they promise unity, order, even a rough equality, if only the sort of equality found under tyrants. Those of us who prefer democracy should be clear about the challenge. Building democratic solidarity in a diverse society is not easy. Here, I'm afraid the comparison with late imperial Rome is anything but comforting. For this was, in truth, a polity held together with corrupt bargains and brute force. A society characterized by savage social inequalities and ruthless economic exploitation on a level that practically rivals our own. An era in which elites pined after a lost republic and the people worried about security and prosperity. And here we're reminded that part of the appeal of Christianity was that it preached honesty and peace, humility and charity, a moral revolution of sorts. And perhaps that is its central lesson for us, that the challenges of our own era will not be overcome with technology or rationality, but only with a moral revolution of some kind that seeks to bring a sort of heaven down to earth again.